this is the problem when there is one party that has total control and there's no other voice in Parliament that is there to hold them to account. Carers are too often ignored. They should be part of the team, working alongside the general practitioner, the district nurse and so on. But fundamentally, I think the really important thing that people have to recognise is that we won't get a good deal for carers and indeed for the people they're caring for unless we invest more in the NHS and in care. And that's why the Lib Dems have come forward with the case for putting a penny on income tax, which would raise £6 billion a year, which would provide vital extra resources both for the NHS but also for care. And unless we make that necessary investment, I think people will be badly let down. And the Lib Dems, I think, are the only party with a clearly costed plan to demonstrate how the extra money can be found for the NHS and the care system.
The Labour Party has suggested, in effect, a national care service. Indeed, they've used that phrase. Do you feel that that perhaps is the answer?
Well, it depends what they mean by that. It begs a lot of questions. I don't want a sort of takeover by the NHS because a lot of people say that if care services locally were sort of run from Whitehall, we could end up in a worse situation. What I want to see instead is a complete joining together, an integration of health and social care. It's ridiculous, actually, if you think about it for more than a moment, that we have two separate systems, a health system and a care system, running side by side, one free, one means tested. The Conservative proposals make the divide even worse. So instead of that, we need to be bringing the two together. As a long-term plan, the Lib Dems are saying we should have a dedicated NHS and care tax shown on your pay packet, and it would be informed by an independent assessment of how much the NHS and the care system needed, and then political parties would say whether they were prepared to meet that assessment of need.
You've campaigned yourself, based on your family experience, on the issues of mental health. Where do you see this going? Because there seems to be an awful lot of talk about it, and if you're elected, how could this talk be put into action?
Well, what frustrates me a lot is the gap, in a way, between the rhetoric and the reality. So we legislated in the coalition for what we call parity of esteem, equality between physical health and mental health. But we're a million miles away from achieving that. And the thing that I felt most strongly about, in a way, was that in the last decade, the Labour government rightly introduced maximum waiting times so that you didn't have to wait too long for an operation, for cancer treatment and indeed in A&E departments. But they left out mental health. There were no maximum waiting time standards in mental health, and that meant that mental health was always disadvantaged. So I embarked on a plan to introduce the same right to get treatment on a timely basis in mental health as in physical health. We introduced the first maximum waiting time standards for early intervention in psychosis and for psychological therapies, but we now need to make them comprehensive so that everyone, including children and young people who have a mental ill health problem, get access to treatment on a timely basis. But the Tories haven't invested in it. And they accept it in principle, but they won't put the money behind it, so it won't happen. Now, because we're raising money through a penny on income tax, we can earmark £1 billion of that per year to invest in mental health for both children and young people and for adults, and you could make a massive difference with that money.
You clearly feel passionately about the issue of mental health. In terms of welfare, for example, as part of the coalition government, you've had to vote for, in effect, austerity. How do you square that with your own personal passion on the subject of mental health?
Well, there were often very difficult decisions to take in the coalition, and indeed I think we made some mistakes. But I would just make this point. When we went into power in 2010, we were faced with a deficit. In other words, the country was spending £160 billion a year more than we were bringing in taxes. And if you look around the world at the countries that haven't got to grips with their public finances, it's always actually the most vulnerable people who lose out the most. So I think we had to get public finances in order. That involved some difficult decisions. We had always to compromise compromise with Conservatives. We stopped them doing a lot of things that I think would have been very bad. But, you know, on something like the bedroom tax, I think we made a mistake. I don't think we should have done that. We recognised that mistake and sought to change it, but the Tories wouldn't go along with that change. But I've also been chairing a commission on mental health for the West Midlands. And one of the things that we've secured funding for from government, £10 million for a big trial of what's called independent IPS, independent personal support. And it's basically about helping people with mental ill health get back into work. And we know it works, but we haven't invested sufficiently in it. And I think if people are able to work and want to work, then we should help them to get back into work at the same time as protecting vulnerable people who are unable to work.
Much has been made of social care funding proposals by the Conservatives. Indeed, our audience, I would say, that's the subject that they're most interested in and feel most strongly about. How can you go ahead and protect, say, someone's inheritance?
Well, so the Conservative plan for elderly care, I think, is just completely ill thought through. It feels like a back of a fab packet. It's made people in this area both angry but also quite anxious because the reality is that for many people who at the moment get care at home free or at a very low cost, they could be faced typically with £15,000 charges a year. And for people with complex needs, it could be a lot more than that. And the cruel thing is that this is, you know, the lottery of life. None of us know who may be affected. I met a chap just this morning who's suffered a stroke. He's a working age man. His wife works in an NHS cottage hospital in North Norfolk, which is now under threat. They suddenly face a very worrying future. And if the care proposals that the Tories have put forward go ahead, they could lose most of their capital. And this idea of the £100,000 being protected, that's not even a legitimate claim, because it's only protected from care costs. But if you go into a care home, half of your costs are accommodation costs. I suspect, they haven't answered the question, but that will all come out of the £100,000. And so people could be left with far less than that. What we ought to be doing is pooling our risk, protecting all of us from the risk of catastrophic loss. And that's what the cap on care costs did. That's what Andrew Dilnot recommended to us. The Lib Dems negotiated to secure it in the coalition. We legislated for it, and now the Tories have abandoned it, which I think is absolutely shocking. And that's what we're campaigning to do. We will introduce the cap on care costs, and we will continue to put pressure on the government to do that.
At what level would you cap care costs?
Well, under the coalition, we said it would be at 72,000. Ideally, I would like it to be lower than that. But I think that's better than nothing, which is the Conservative position now. She's now said that they'll consult on some sort of cap, but we have no idea what that means. It could be 200,000, 300,000. We now know what their instincts are. We know what they plan to do. And all they're saying is they'll consult on it. Now, I know what public consultations are like. It often is a sort of fait accompli, and they go through the motions to demonstrate that they're listening, and then they do what they were planning to do in the first place.
Finally, one of the concerns that carers in our audience have raised over the past few weeks and months is feelings of guilt that they've fallen out of love with the person they're caring for, or fallen out of good feelings for the person they've cared for, and in some cases been criticised by professionals. Now, there's been a drive for some time from government to say people should be back into work. If you're re-elected and someone comes to your first constituency surgery and says to you, on Monday morning I've got to decide whether to take this job offer or not, what would you say to them?
Well, look, I think it has to be much more personal. I think a sort of one-size-fits-all approach can be very dangerous. There are many people who are out of work, who have disabilities and who have care needs, who may want to work and may be able to do some types of work, particularly if you make adjustments for them. And we ought to do far more to enable those people to work. And with work often goes dignity and self-respect and a sense that you're making a contribution. And we ought to do everything we can to enable those people to do that work. But we also must protect those who can't work. I have a particular concern. The Conservatives have recently changed the rules after a court ruling which disadvantages people with mental distress who need support in travelling. Now they are literally discriminating against people with mental ill health as against people with physical health problems. So if someone came to see me in my advice surgery, I would do what I always do. I'd seek to address that particular individual's concerns, work with them to try and get the right solution for them. But you're up against a system nationally which too often is a blunt instrument, too often doesn't take individual circumstances into account.